She didn't look like much. That was the point. The Naval Medical Center Portsmouth emergency room at 6 in the morning was the kind of controlled chaos that broke people in their first week and refined everyone else into something harder. Gurneys rolled across linoleum worn pale by decades of boots and wheels. Monitors screamed at frequencies designed to cut through noise and panic. Curtains yanked open, yanked shut. Someone somewhere was calling out a blood pressure, reading like it was a verdict. The smell of the place was antiseptic and copper and burned coffee, and it hit you in the chest the moment the doors opened, a reminder that this was where the body's failures arrived to be judged. Nobody stood still in a room like that, except her. She was in the corner near the supply station, hands at her sides, eyes moving. Not the frantic scan of someone overwhelmed, something slower, methodical. She looked at the room the way a man looks at a field before he decides how to cross it. She clocked the exits, the angles, the distance between the trauma bay and the medication dispensary, the one fluorescent tube near the far wall that flickered every 11 seconds. She noted it once, filed it away, and never looked at it again. Her name tag read Harlow. Below that in smaller letters, Corsman. She was 27 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 120 pounds if her boots were wet. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, so tight it looked like it had never been anything else. Her face was the kind of face that didn't give you much. Not cold, not warm, just present, just watching. The kind of face that had decided a long time ago that expression was a resource and resources were not to be wasted. Dr. Callum Bridger noticed her for the first time that morning and dismissed her in the same breath. He was 51 years old and had been running this ER for 11 of them. He had a jaw like a blunt instrument and gray at his temples that he'd earned in ways that had nothing to do with age. He had trained corpsmen by the dozen. Most came in one of two flavors, eager and inexperienced, or experienced and burned out. The ones who stood quietly in corners made him nervous in a way he couldn't fully articulate, so he chose instead to be dismissive. It was cleaner that way. He walked past her without breaking stride. Harlow, Trauma 2 needs restocking. Celine and Gauze both running low. She turned from the window without being asked twice. Yes, sir. That was it. Bridger was already gone, moving toward the intake desk where the night shift was running down the morning's backlog. He didn't think about her again for another 40 minutes. Dale Briggs thought about her almost immediately. Briggs was 33 and built like the kind of man who'd played linebacker in high school and never fully let go of that identity. He was good at his job in the way that loud people are sometimes good at their jobs, through momentum and confidence, and the sheer social mass of taking up space. He had been at Portsmouth for 4 years. He knew where everything was, who to call, which vending machine on the second floor still gave you 2 bags for the price of 1. He was the kind of person a new corpsman was supposed to learn from, and he knew it, and he used it in the way people use the things they know. He found Tessa restocking Trauma 2 and leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. You the new one? She didn't stop what she was doing. Yes. Transfer from where? She paused for just a fraction of a second. Long enough to answer, not long enough to invite follow-up. Expeditionary. Briggs made a sound in his throat, the sound of a man deciding what to do with an answer that told him nothing. Expeditionary, right. He looked her over without pretending he wasn't. You gonna be all right in here? It moves fast. She placed the last saline bag on the shelf, closed the cabinet, and turned to look at him directly. Not aggressive, just level. The look of someone who had been assessed by people far more qualified to assess her than Dale Briggs, and who had long since stopped finding it interesting. I'll keep up. She walked past him. He turned to watch her go, then made a different sound. This one had a small smile in it that wasn't kind. Chief Wade Carver had been watching all of it from the nurses' station across the hall. Carver was 46 with 22 years of Navy service behind him and a face that had heard more confessions than any priest he'd ever met. He was the kind of man who took up very little social space, despite being physically large, because he had learned long ago that the quietest person in the room was usually the most consequential. He had been a corpsman in 2 combat deployments and 3 humanitarian operations, and had seen enough of both ends of the human spectrum to know that the things that mattered most were almost never the things people announced. He had noticed Tessa Harlow from the moment she walked through the door on her first day. Not because she was remarkable, because of the way she was unremarkable. The deliberate quality of her smallness, like a volume dial turned down by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. He had seen that precise calibration before. Not often, but enough times to understand what it meant. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't say anything to anyone. He simply noted what he'd seen, stored it in the part of his memory reserved for things that would matter later, and went back to work. The first week passed the way first weeks always pass, through accumulation. Small moments that compound into something larger before anyone realizes the compounding has been happening. The ER ran 24 hours across rotating shifts, and Tessa Harlow fit herself into it the way a stone fits into a stream bed, shaped by the current while changing the current's direction in ways that were subtle enough that nobody could say exactly when the change had happened. She was there when she was supposed to be there. She was where she was supposed to be. She did what was asked without argument and without decoration. She did not try to be liked. She did not try to be noticed. She ate her lunch in 20 minutes and spent the remaining break time near a window on the east side of the building, always with her back to the wall and her eyes toward the parking lot below. Briggs noticed the parking lot habit on the third day. He didn't address it directly. He said it sideways the way certain people do when they want to land a point without appearing to throw it. He was in the break room with two other corpsmen when Tessa came in to refill her coffee. He waited until she'd poured her cup and was heading back out. "Hey, Harlow." His voice had the easy broadcast quality of someone comfortable being the loudest thing in the room. "You know you can sit at the table with the rest of us, right? You don't have to eat by the window every day like a cat waiting for birds." The two other corpsmen laughed. It was the kind of laugh that follows the kind of joke that isn't quite mean enough to object to. Tessa stopped. She turned around. She looked at Briggs with an expression that contained no anger whatsoever, which somehow made it more uncomfortable than anger would have been. "I like the light," she said. She left. Briggs stared at the door for a moment. "Weird," he said, mostly to the room. Carver at the far end of the break room had been reading a patient chart. He did not look up from it. He did not change his expression. But he turned a page that he had already read, which was the only visible indication that he had heard anything at all. The second incident happened 5 days later, and it was less manufactured than the first. Briggs had been managing a particularly difficult intake, a young sailor with a history of anxiety, presenting with chest pain, that kept resolving and returning, the kind of ambiguous case that required patience, and that patience was not Briggs's natural register. He had been short with the patient twice, and Tessa had been in the bay for the second half of it, and she had done a quiet thing that Briggs noticed only in retrospect. She had positioned herself at the patient's left side and spoken to him in a low, continuous murmur, while Briggs ran the assessment, keeping the patient calm in a way that made the assessment easier without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing it. When Briggs finished and walked out, he passed Carver in the hallway. "She makes the room work better," Carver said without preamble, without looking at him. Briggs didn't answer, but he walked more slowly than usual back to the charge desk, and the expression on his face was the preliminary stage of something that would take a while longer to complete. It was a Thursday morning or just past 11 when the first real test arrived. The patient was a Navy petty officer. Second class, 19 years old, home on emergency leave, found collapsed beside his car in the visitor parking lot. His vitals were unstable in a way that matched heat exhaustion, at first reading elevated heart rate, low blood pressure, cold sweat. Briggs had a working diagnosis in 45 seconds and delivered it with the confidence of someone who had been right often enough to stop distinguishing between certainty and probability. "Heat stroke. Get him cooled down. Let's move." Tessa was on the left side of the gurney before anyone gave her an instruction. She had 2 fingers on the patient's wrist, but she wasn't counting his pulse. She was watching his chest, the way it moved, the asymmetry between the left side and the right, small, easy to miss if you were looking at the face or the chart or the overall picture rather than the specific localized evidence of what the body was and wasn't doing. Bridger came through from the hallway, glanced at the chart someone handed him. "Heat presentation." "That's what it looks like," Briggs said. Tessa said very quietly, "His trachea is deviated." Briggs turned to look at her. "What? His trachea?" She kept her voice level and her eyes on the patient. "It's shifted right. Breath sounds on the left are absent." Bridger stopped. He leaned over the patient and took 4 seconds to assess what she had described. The 4 seconds had the quality of time that is not really 4 seconds at all. "Get me a 16 gauge, Bridger said. Briggs opened his mouth. "You think she's right? The heat presentation is consistent with—" "Get me the needle, Dale." The needle came. Bridger performed the decompression himself, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular, line left side. The release of pressure was audible, immediate. The patient's oxygen saturation, which had been declining quietly toward a number that would have required a very different kind of conversation, began to climb. Tension pneumothorax, a rib fracture from a car accident 2 days prior that the patient had not mentioned, because he was 19 years old and had decided he was fine. The fracture had allowed air to accumulate in the chest cavity, building pressure against the heart, reducing cardiac output, producing symptoms that looked like heat illness until the moment they stopped looking like heat illness and started looking like cardiac arrest. If they had cooled him down and waited, he would have deteriorated. Briggs stood back from the gurney and looked at Tessa. She was adjusting the patient's oxygen line, not looking at anyone in the room. Her hands moved with the particular ease that doesn't come from training alone. You could teach the mechanics to anyone with sufficient aptitude. You could not teach the absence of hesitation that came from having performed those mechanics in conditions that did not allow for hesitation. Bridger read the chart for another moment. When he looked up, his gaze went to Tessa before he caught himself and redirected it to the room. "Good catch," he said to the air. He left the bay. Briggs stayed. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. "Could have been heat stroke," he said, though the conviction that usually lived in his voice was running noticeably thin. Tessa looked at him once. "Could have been," she agreed. She went back to work. In the hallway, Carver was coming the other direction with a supply cart. He and Bridger passed without speaking. But Carver's eyes went toward trauma 2, and then to the middle distance, and something in his expression did the small settling thing it did when a piece of information he had been carrying found its correct location. He kept moving. The shift change brief the following week was where Briggs made a different kind of mistake, the kind that is not malicious, but that reveals something about the person making it. Bridger ran the brief standing in the hallway outside the charge desk. He went through the overnight cases, the pending labs, 2 admissions still waiting on beds upstairs. When he reached the pneumothorax case in the review section, he mentioned it as a learning point. Consider secondary injury in all trauma patients presenting with ambiguous vital sign clusters. Briggs said without particular heat, without looking at Tessa, "1 correct call in 2 weeks. We'll go ahead and give her a gold star." It wasn't vicious. Briggs was rarely vicious. He said things like this as social currency to remind the room of its existing hierarchy and his position within it. He probably didn't think about it again for the rest of the morning. Tessa said nothing. She stood slightly outside the group, coffee in hand, looking at the middle distance, in the way she always looked at it, as if she were reading information from a frequency that wasn't available to everyone present. Carver, standing to her left, looked at the floor. After the brief, he walked to the supply station where Tessa had begun her first task of the shift. He pulled a chart from the rack beside her without looking at her. "For what it's worth," he said quietly enough that it wasn't for anyone else, "the patient's mother came by yesterday, brought flowers, left them at the front desk with a note." He paused. No name on the note, just 2 words. "Thank you." He walked away. Tessa set down the inventory clipboard. She looked at the door for a moment. Then she picked the clipboard back up and kept counting. The thing about a particular kind of hard-won composure is that it doesn't appear from nowhere. It is built the same way scar tissue builds slowly over time through the repeated application of pressure in the same direction until the tissue stops tearing and starts holding. Tessa Harlow had started building hers at 10 years old on Saturday mornings in rural Virginia with a rifle that was almost as long as she was and a father who believed that the most important things he could give her were not protection and comfort, but capability and judgment. His name was Raymond Harlow. Ray to his family, Gunny to everyone else. Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Harlow of the 1st Marine Division's Scout Sniper. He was not a large man, he was not physically imposing, but he occupied space with a kind of gravity that you felt before you understood it, and he had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent a long time in environments where stillness was not a preference but a survival requirement. He had 2 rules about the range: eyes open, breathing steady. Everything else, he said, was just math. He took her out on Saturdays to a stretch of public land where the hills rolled out long and brown in the Virginia fall. He taught her the way he had been taught by standing beside her and saying very little until she got something wrong, and then saying exactly as much as was necessary to help her not get it wrong again. No more, no less. He trusted her to close the gap between his instruction and her execution without requiring the gap to be bridged word by word. She was small even then. The rifle was almost as long as she was. He didn't modify the equipment for her. He taught her to adapt to it. By the time she was 12, she could read wind drift from the bend of dry grass at 300 yards. By 14, she didn't need him to tell her when her breathing was wrong. She could feel it in the space between heartbeats, the small physiological fact of when the body was most still and when it wasn't, and what the difference meant for the mathematics of a shot at distance. She got 4 years of Saturdays. September 2011, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. A Marine convoy on a road that had been cleared 48 hours earlier. A pressure plate that had not been there when the road was cleared. Raymond Harlow was 52 years old and on his third deployment and in the wrong vehicle at the moment of activation. He had 12 minutes between the blast and the evacuation helicopter. He spent most of them conscious, which the chaplain later told Tessa's mother was remarkable, and which Tessa, when she heard it years afterward, understood to mean that her father had been fully aware of exactly what was happening to him and had chosen to spend those 12 minutes being present rather than absent. He did not make it to the helicopter. She was 14. She was in school in Virginia when the uniformed officer knocked on the door. 3 knocks, even-spaced, unhurried, the knock of someone who has been trained to deliver this particular kind of news with the care it deserves. She was standing in the hallway when her mother opened the door, and she watched her mother's face change in a way that she would spend the next decade doing her best to forget and never fully managing it. Her mother held it together for approximately 6 hours. Then she sat across from Tessa at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the wood surface between them, flat and very still, the posture of someone holding themselves together by physical act of will, and said in a voice that had been stripped to its essential structure, "Promise me you'll never pick up a gun." Tessa looked at her mother's hands. "I promise," she said. She meant it completely, in the full and costly way that people mean the things that require the most of them to say. She kept that promise for 12 years. 3 weeks into her posting at Portsmouth, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning, the first indication of what Tessa Harlow was actually carrying presented itself in a way that was small enough to miss if you weren't paying the right kind of attention. She was at the medication cart in the main hallway logging inventory when she felt it, before she heard it, a low concussive displacement from somewhere beyond the building's exterior wall, directional, the kind of physical information that her nervous system had been trained to process and categorize in the time it took most people to register that they'd heard something unusual. Her head turned before her conscious mind finished forming a response. Her eyes went to the highest corner of the corridor, not the door, not the window, the elevated corner, the position from which a threat would have the greatest advantage. Her right hand moved from the medication cart to her hip, found nothing there, and returned to the cart. She stood absolutely still for 1 second. Then she continued logging the medication inventory. Carver had been at the nurse's station 12 feet away. He had seen the head turn, the specific trajectory of it, the precision of where her eyes went and why. He had seen the movement of her right hand and where it reached and what the reaching meant. And then he had watched the return to the task, smooth, automatic, the reset of someone who had performed it enough times that it cost nothing and revealed nothing to anyone who wasn't already looking for it. He set down his pen. He looked at the left sleeve of her uniform, pushed slightly up from the motion of reaching for the upper shelf of the cart. At the edge of a scar along the inside of her forearm, pale old, running at the specific angle of something that had entered from the outside rather than originated from within. Not a surgical scar, not any kind of accident. He looked at the hallway in front of him for a long, quiet moment. He picked up his pen and went back to what he'd been doing. 22 years of service had taught him many things, and one of them was this. The people who carried what Tessa Harlow was clearly carrying were also the people who surfaced it on their own timeline, in their own way when the moment required it. Pressing them was not only ineffective, it was a form of disrespect toward the discipline it had cost them to carry it in the first place. He would wait. Whatever this was, it was going to come clear on its own. He didn't have to wait long. Outside in the far corner of the base parking lot, a black Ford F-250 sat with its engine off. The man behind the wheel had his phone open on the passenger seat, running the installation's public access duty roster, accessible to anyone with a .mil login, updated every 48 hours. He was confirming one name before he moved. He had 2 bullet wounds dressed in field bandaging that had held through 11 hours of driving, and he had given himself a hard limit. That name had to appear on the active roster before he drove to the door. He would not go in blind. He would not put her in a situation she hadn't chosen. The roster updated at 0849. Harlow TER day shift. He started the engine. The building's east entrance was 60 meters away. He had come a very long way to reach it. And when he came through those doors, nothing in the Naval Medical Center Portsmouth emergency room was going to be the same. The black Ford F-250 rolled to a stop against the ambulance bay curb at 7 minutes past 8, no military plates, 2 flat tires it had been riding for the last 40 miles, and a driver who should not have been driving. He fell out of the driver's side door and caught himself on the frame before he hit the ground. Tessa heard the impact before anyone else registered it. She was at the far end of the corridor, and she was already moving by the time Briggs, who was standing closer to the entrance, had finished turning his head toward the sound. The man outside was approximately 6'2" of structural integrity, held together by field dressing and the particular form of willpower that is not stubbornness, but necessity. Civilian clothes, dark jeans, gray shirt that had started the day tucked in and was no longer anything close to it. Left shoulder wrapped in a compression bandage applied correctly, which meant applied by someone with training, possibly himself. Right thigh tourniquet above the midpoint, properly positioned, properly tightened. Not the application of someone working from a first aid pamphlet. The application of someone who had practiced it enough times to do it fast alone and almost certainly in the dark. 2 gunshot wounds. He had driven himself to a naval medical facility, and when the gurney reached him and the team moved to take his weight, he did not surrender to it the way injured men surrender to assistance. He let them take him, but he set the terms. Tessa was at the gurney before it cleared the bay entrance. 2 fingers at his neck, pulse fast and thin but present. Color poor in the way that spoke of blood loss managed across hours, not minutes. He had been making conscious decisions about how to ration what his body had left for a significant portion of the night. Left shoulder dressing saturated through the outer layer, wound still active beneath it. Right thigh tourniquet, effective, distal pulse weak. Airway clear. Breathing labored but present on both sides. No tracheal deviation. She checked his pupils. He opened his eyes. The moment held for exactly 1 second. Brown eyes, clear, fully present. Not the eyes of a man who had accepted the fog that blood loss sometimes offered as a form of relief. These were the eyes of someone who had been calculating precisely and continuously exactly how much consciousness he needed to preserve for this specific moment. He looked at her, she looked at him. Something behind her eyes shifted a fraction of recognition, a piece of a larger equation that had been waiting 3 years for its final variable. He tried to sit up. The paramedic at his left side put a hand on his chest. "Sir, you need to stay." The man's right hand came up. Not fast, not aggressive, with the kind of authority that stops motion without requiring force, the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, not because of volume, but because of certainty. The paramedic's hand fell away. His right shoulder pulled back, his spine aligned. His body performed the action that years of conditioning had made automatic, regardless of blood loss, regardless of pain, regardless of the medical equipment currently attached to him. He came to attention. "Commander Harlow," he said. His voice was rough from hours of managed pain and controlled breathing, but it was steady in the way that mattered. "Ma'am?" The emergency room stopped. Not all of it. The monitors kept running. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and went to voicemail. The building continued its business, but the human content of that bay. Briggs mid-sentence Bridger, who had come through from the charge desk, Carver, who had followed at a remove, 2 paramedics, a nursing student observing intake. All of it went still in the way things go still when a sentence has just fundamentally rearranged the room it was spoken in. Briggs had been saying something. Whatever it was left no trace. Bridger stood at the edge of the bay with a patient chart in his hand that he had stopped reading. Carver, slightly back and to the left, was the only person in the bay who did not look at Tessa. He looked at the man on the gurney. He was reading him the way he had been reading Tessa for 3 weeks, carefully, completely filing what he found. Tessa did not flinch. She did not look around to measure who had heard. She did not perform any of the social responses, surprise, embarrassment, denial that the moment seemed to be waiting for. She had known this moment would come eventually. She had not known exactly when or how, but she had known. She looked at the man on the gurney. Her voice dropped to the register that carries without being raised. "At ease, Sergeant. You're bleeding out. Let me work." He lay back. She went back to work. His name was Cole Drummond. Sergeant First Class 3rd Special Forces Group out of Fort Liberty, North Carolina. 36 years old, gunshot wounds sustained approximately 11 hours before his arrival at Portsmouth, the circumstances of which he delivered in the clipped sequential manner of someone trained to present information in the order of its operational relevance rather than its narrative logic. He did not volunteer anything beyond what was directly asked. Neither did Tessa. She worked the bay with the rest of the team. She did not speak unnecessarily. She did not look at Drummond with anything other than clinical attention. She gave Bridger and Briggs and everyone else nothing to hold on to beyond what the work itself required. She moved through the trauma bay with complete professional focus, and the only thing that might have revealed something to someone paying the right kind of attention was how completely unsurprised she was, not by his injuries, not by his arrival, but by the entirety of it. She worked the situation like someone who had always known at some level that a situation like this was coming. Briggs was no longer watching the patient. He was watching her. The easy architecture of his usual expression, the slight performance of someone always positioning for social advantage, was gone. What remained was the face of a man whose working model for a situation has just been handed back to him, with critical sections revised, and who is now doing the effortful and uncomfortable work of rebuilding his understanding from the parts that still hold. Carver moved through the bay, efficiently handing Tessa supplies before she finished reaching for them, a choreography of two people who had never explicitly established it. Bridger caught it. He stored it and said nothing. When Drummond went to imaging and then to surgical consult, Bridger went to his office, sat down at his computer, and typed Tessa Harlow's name into the personnel system. The file came back structurally real correct formatting, correct institutional watermarks. Date of birth, enlistment date, medical certifications, and then where 3 years of posting history should have been access restricted, authorization level 4 required. Contact Naval Special Warfare Command for inquiries. Bridger sat back in his chair. He looked at the screen for a long time. Then he pulled up the internal phone directory and stared at it without picking up the phone. He found Carver in the east hallway during the afternoon shift, changed the narrow window when the building thinned enough for a conversation that didn't require an audience. "How long?" Bridger said. Carver didn't ask what he meant. "First week, the way she stands in a room, the way she moves through it." A pause. The scar on her left forearm. "Why didn't you say anything?" Carver looked at him steadily. "Because it wasn't mine to say, sir." Bridger absorbed this. The ventilation system filled the pause between them, the constant white noise of a building that never stopped running. "Her file is restricted," he said, "level 4. "I know what that means." "Then you know it's not a paperwork issue." "Yes, sir. It means someone with significant authority decided that what she did and where she did it was not information for general circulation." Bridger was quiet for a moment. "What do I do with this, Wade?" Carver looked at him directly. It was the look of a man who had 22 years of considered opinions and who released them carefully only when asked and only when they were worth the release. "She's here," he said. "She's working. She's the best person in this building at keeping people alive in the moments when keeping them alive is genuinely difficult." He paused. "I'd let her carry what she's been carrying and trust that she'll set it down when it's time. The people who carry things like that don't do it without reason." Bridger held his gaze for 2 seconds. "Drummond's asking to speak with her." "I know, I'd let her go." Bridger nodded slowly and walked toward the stairs. The surgical team cleared Drummond for limited conversation that evening. Tessa came at the end of her shift, not because she was told to, but because she had always been going to. She pulled the chair to the side of the bed rather than the foot of it. Parallel. The positioning of people who are not performing a visit, but having a conversation. She sat down. She looked at him. "You look different," he said. "It's been 3 years." "Yeah." He shifted carefully, managing the shoulder. "You look like you're doing okay." "I am." Outside the installation ran its evening operations, the ambient hum of a place that never fully went quiet. "Bridger ran your file," he said. "I know." "It came back level 4? "I know." "He's going to have questions." "He already does." She looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. "What are you doing here, Cole?" The silence before his answer was the silence of someone deciding how much of a true thing to say, not how to construct a story. "I drove here because I needed 2 things in the same building," he said. "A doctor I could trust to run the room if I went under, and you." Portsmouth had both. "I looked Bridger up before I left, checked his record, his case history, his reputation in the community, and the duty roster posts 48 hours in advance on the installation's medical portal, accessible to anyone with a .mil login." A brief pause. "Your name was on the morning shift, so I drove." She said nothing. "Bridger deserves to know who he has working for him," Drummond said. "That's not your decision." "No, but I'll tell you this." He held her gaze. "You've been here 3 weeks, and you've already changed how this room works. Carver knows what you are. Bridger is figuring it out. Even Briggs is recalibrating whether he knows it yet or not." He shifted again. "You've been carrying the hiding for 3 years, Commander. The reason it made sense, it's changed." She looked at him. "Nash," he said. The word landed with a weight that was different from ordinary words. She didn't move, didn't change expression. But something in the room changed, something barometric, a pressure differential too small to name and too real to ignore. "Nash is reported K1A," she said. "Exactly level." "Reported bad," he said. She held his gaze. He held hers and did not elaborate. The silence extended until it became its own kind of statement. Bridger came to Drummond the following morning. Coffee he didn't drink. questions he didn't read from a list. He sat parallel to the bed, not at the foot of it, not standing over it, and Drummond read the positioning in about 4 seconds. "You want to know about Harlow," he said. Bridger didn't pretend otherwise. What Drummond told him was partial, bounded by clearance, but sufficient for a man of Bridger's intelligence to close the remaining gaps himself. The program had grown out of the Defense Department's 2015 decision opening all combat roles to women. Not the public-facing implementation, but a parallel operational assessment that asked a different and more specific question: whether certain operational contexts required a profile of operator that current force structure built entirely around male personnel was structurally incapable of providing. The program was small, fewer than a dozen participants across its full operational life. The selection criteria required dual competency from the beginning: medical training and tactical qualification, both at a level that most candidates could achieve one of, but not both. Tessa Harlow had been selected at 22. She had completed the qualification pipeline in the upper tier of her cohort and been commissioned commander at 23, a rank nobody received at 23 without a record that made the promotion board uncomfortable with any other decision. In 2 years of operational service, her unit had documented 41 lives saved in direct action in support scenarios, 0 friendly fire incidents, 0 operational security compromises attributable to her element. The program had closed in 2021. Administrative reasons, Drummond said in the tone of someone conveying the official position and simultaneously communicating that the official position was not the complete story. He told Bridger about Raymond Harlow, Gunnery Sergeant, Marine Scout, Sniper K, I, a Helmand Province, September 2011, 4 years of Saturday mornings in Virginia. A daughter who was 14 when the knock came. A mother who asked for a promise at a kitchen table, and a daughter who made it and kept it for 12 years. He told Bridger about the final operation of her classified service. About Chief Petty Officer Derek Nash, Tessa's closest operational partner through 2 years of deployments, whose after-action status was listed as killed in action, whose body had not been recovered, and whose circumstances Tessa had never accepted as fully and honestly resolved. She left after the Nash report, Drummond said. She said she was done, transferred to conventional medical service, worked 18 months in Okinawa, put in for Portsmouth. He was quiet for a moment. She could have stayed in. She chose this. I think she chose it because here she can keep her mother's promise and still do the thing she was built for. She doesn't have to choose between them. Bridger sat with this. She never told me, he said. The slight displacement of a man recalibrating how much had been present in his building without his awareness. No, Drummond said. She probably thought the work would speak for itself. He held Bridger's gaze. It has. The question is what you do now that you have the explanation for what you've already been watching. Bridger looked at the window. The base was running its ordinary Tuesday outside it. He looked back at Drummond. Thank you, he said. He stood, picked up the coffee he hadn't touched, and walked out. The alert came at 13:47 hours. It moved through the installation's communications with the specific register of something that had escalated past the stage where waiting was an option. Briggs was at the charge desk and took the initial relay. His face changed in the particular way that Tessa passing behind him read and categorized before he finished processing it himself. She stopped when he said her name. He was looking at her differently than he had looked at her at any point in the past 3 weeks. Not apologetically, not with the repositioning energy of someone seeking credit for updating their position. With something simpler and less comfortable, the look of a man who is uncertain for the first time and is choosing to be honest about it instead of performing certainty he doesn't have. Situation, he said. Sniper, POI on a structure north of the vehicle depot. Has eyes on the officer housing approach road. 2 colonels and a JAG major pinned behind a vehicle at the road junction. Can't move. Base sniper element. Rodriguez took around 40 minutes ago. Incoming ET, a 12 minutes. He held her gaze. Backup from Quantico is 45 minutes out. Distance, 850 meters. Wind northwest 5 to 8 knots variable. Bridger came through the hallway door. A military police officer behind him was carrying a hard-sided case foam-lined, latched at 3 points, that was identifiable to anyone who had spent time around long-range weapon systems. Bridger looked at Tessa. She looked at the case. The calculation she ran was not about capability. She had never had any uncertainty about her capability. The calculation was older than that and more complicated, built from 12 years of a promise and 3 years of trying to find a way to live inside it that didn't cost too much. From down the hall from room 214 where the door had been left open, Drummond's voice carried without strain. She can make that shot, sir. I've seen her work. Let her go. Bridger looked at Tessa. He was waiting. She thought about her father. Not the grief of it that had its time, and she kept it to its time. Just him. The way he stood behind her on cold Virginia mornings with his hands in his pockets, saying almost nothing, trusting her to find the answer between his last instruction and the next one. Eyes open, he had said, breathing steady. Everything else is just math. She stepped forward and opened the case. The Beret M8-2A1 came out of the foam with both her hands, and the muscle memory of the grip arrived before any other thought familiar in the way of things knitted into the body, rather than merely learned by it. She carried it to the roof. The northeast corner, bipod down, prone, 850 meters to the target structure. Wind 5 to 8 knots from the northwest variable, in the way that meant the calculation couldn't be solved once and held. It had to run continuously, updated against what the air was actually doing at each moment, rather than what it had been doing 3 seconds ago. She ranged the position a third-floor window, east facing the suppressor, distinguishable from the surrounding frame as a slightly different quality of shadow. She adjusted the scope. It had been zeroed at a different distance by its previous user. She felt the offset before she could have articulated it. She took her breath. 4 seconds in, she held, she squeezed. The round traveled 850 meters through variable crosswind and struck the window frame 8 inches left of the intended impact point. The target shifted back from the window. Did not go down. She worked the bolt. She did not react to the miss. She made 3 adjustments. Scope calibration, wind vector correction for the current gust cycle, lead elbow angle. Her father had told her once, a miss tells you everything a hit can't. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. She took the next breath, held at the bottom of her respiratory cycle, in the space between heartbeats. She squeezed. The target went down. She held position 3 seconds, confirming through the scope. Then she was already moving, and from the northwest corner of the roofline, simultaneously with the motion of her rising, came a sharp crack and a line of hot impact across the back of her left forearm. She assessed it in the time it took to stand. Dorsal surface below the wrist, concrete fragment from the parapet edge, driven outward by a round that had struck 2 feet from her hand. A second shooter, ground level northwest corner of the outbuilding. The primary position had been covered. The secondary had not. She had been tracked from the moment she fired. She closed her fingers against her palm. Full function. The military police officer behind her was already on his radio. Second shooter, northwest corner, ground level, base security is converging now. His voice was clipped and professional. Target is down. She was at the stairs. At the bottom, Bridger met her. He saw the left arm first. You're hit. Dorsal forearm laceration, intact function. She kept walking. 2 minutes. She wrapped it herself, compression dressing, one-handed quickly. When she flexed the hand twice and confirmed the dressing's stability, Bridger handed her the trauma bag without being asked. It was a small gesture. It was not a small thing. She took it and went to the vehicle. Bridger was at the trauma bay entrance when she came back through the doors 40 minutes later. The 3 officers were stable. The convoy's corpsman had a peroneal artery laceration with the tourniquet holding. 2 other wounded were manageable. She gave Bridger the field status in 12 words, and he nodded and told her the surgical team was already staged. He looked at her for a moment at the left arm, at the dressing, worked through with blood from the sustained pressure work she'd done at the convoy, at the fact that she was standing with her hands at her sides, and the same expression she brought to the medication cart in the morning brief in every ordinary moment of the past 3.5 weeks. He looked at the hallway around them, the building he had run for 11 years, the charge desk, the supply stations, the trauma bays, everything that moved through them every day. Welcome aboard, Commander, he said, not ceremony, not sarcasm. The specific words of a man closing a particular account, acknowledging what had been present before he had the language for it. She met his eyes. Thank you, sir, she said. He nodded once and went back to work. Carver was at the charge desk. He had watched the exchange from a distance that was close enough to read and far enough not to intrude. When Bridger walked away, he looked at Tessa once, a look that contained no surprise, no vindication, no performance of having known. Just acknowledgement. The quiet completion of something he had been carrying patiently since her first day. He gave her a small nod. She returned it. That was enough. That was exactly enough. The second alert came 31 hours later. It came the way the worst things tend to come, without warning, without transition, with the flat, indifferent timing of a system that does not consult human readiness before making its demands. Tessa was at the charge desk midway through a medication reconciliation when the base communications channel opened across the overhead. She heard the first four words of the relay and set her pen down. A logistics convoy on the installation's northern perimeter road had been engaged. 3 vehicles. The lead vehicle had taken damage from an improvised device, the kind of device that should not have existed on a domestic military installation, the kind whose presence indicated a security penetration that would be a catastrophic problem for a great many people to work through after the immediate human cost had been addressed. The second and third vehicles had halted. Personnel were pinned. The convoy's corpsman had been struck in the first 30 seconds badly enough to be unable to perform his function. 3 confirmed wounded, possibly 4. Blast injury fragmentation, overpressure, secondary impact. The wound set that deteriorated fast without intervention and held well with it if the intervention came in time. And it was not coming because a sniper on elevated ground at 1,100 meters from the convoy's position was suppressing both approach routes, preventing the staged medical response team from moving. 1,100 meters, 250 meters farther than yesterday. Wind had shifted now from the south 8 to 12 knots, gusting and variable in the way that made it a different mathematical problem than a steady wind. And she would be going into the engagement zone afterward to work the wounded in a road that was not yet fully secure. Bridger came out of the trauma bay and stood at the center of the hallway. He looked at Tessa. She was already looking at him. Behind her, Carver set down what he was carrying. At the far end of the hallway, Briggs had gone still. Bridger went through it. 1,100 meters. Wind shifted. She would be going in afterward. He was working through the calculation probability against the weight of a decision that was and wasn't his to make. I need to know, he started. Carver's voice came from behind Tessa. Quiet, certain. The voice of 22 years of knowing the difference between an opinion and a fact. Sir, let her go. Bridger looked at him, 2 full seconds. Then he looked at Tessa. Get the kit. The roof again, same corner, bipod down, prone. The light was lower and harder than yesterday, angled in a way that put partial glare on the scope's objective lens. She adjusted her position 4 degrees to compensate. She ranged the target structure, a maintenance outbuilding, beyond the perimeter fence unlocked and unoccupied, and positioned to offer both concealment and the exact field of fire someone had needed. 1,100 meters. The wind was cycling 8 knots, a pause, a gust to 11, settling back. She timed 3 cycles, found the pattern, identified the window in each cycle where the variable dropped toward its lower bound, and held for 2 to 3 seconds before rising again. That was her window. Not the gust, not the average. The floor of the cycle where the air was closest to what the mathematics required. She thought about her father for a moment. Not with grief that had its hour, and she kept it carefully to that hour and no more. Just him. His hands on her shoulders on a cold Virginia morning, adjusting the angle of her weight over the stock. His voice, patient and undecorated, read the wind first. Everything else follows. She read the wind. She waited for the floor of the cycle. 4 seconds in, hold. The space between heartbeats, she squeezed. The round traveled 1,100 meters, and the shooter in the outbuilding went down. She confirmed through the scope, 3 seconds, no movement, and she was already standing, already turning toward the stairs, and the military police officer behind her was on his radio confirming the neutralization and reporting that base security had contained the secondary position from yesterday's operation, which had been the subject of a thorough overnight sweep. The road was as clear as it was going to get. She went down to the vehicle. Briggs was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He was not performing anything. His arms were at his sides, and his face had the look of a man who had made a decision and was standing quietly on the other side of it without needing anyone else to acknowledge it. I'm going with you, he said. She didn't argue. She got in the back of the response vehicle. He got in the front. The vehicle moved. 300 meters from the eastern gate to the pinned convoy. The team deployed before the vehicle fully stopped. Tessa went to the convoy's corpsman. First, he was the most exposed, and he was the one who had gone down trying to do exactly what she was now doing. He was conscious. Fragmentation wound to the right leg below the knee, significant soft tissue damage, peroneal artery involved. Fast and continuous bleeding already through the field, dressing he'd managed to apply to himself. She cut the dressing, hemostatic gauze. Pressure, both hands, 30 seconds. The laceration on her left arm pulling with the force of it, and she breathed through it and kept the pressure exactly where it needed to be. Tourniquet combat application. Tourniquet tightened, time noted and marker on the band. Stay still, she said. You're going to be all right. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has made peace with a bad outcome and is now being offered a different one. Yes, ma'am. She moved. The second casualty was behind the cargo vehicle. A sergeant in his early 30s, blast injury to the torso. breathing in the short labored intervals that told her what she needed to know before she had finished the visual assessment. Tension pneumothorax. She opened his shirt. Second intercostal space midclavicular line. The needle went in, and the pressure released immediately audibly, and his breathing changed within seconds. "Look at the sky," she said. "Just breathe." He looked at the sky. She moved to the third vehicle. The third casualty presented two injury points, simultaneously fragmentation wound to the left shoulder, with the fragment still seated, and a head laceration that had bled in the dramatic way head wounds bleed, coating his face thoroughly enough to read as worse than it was. She cleared his airway. Pupils no significant deficit. She packed the shoulder wound and applied pressure with her right hand and stabilized his head with her left in the wound on her left forearm, pulled again harder this time, and she breathed through it methodically and held both hands exactly where they needed to be. Right hand on the shoulder, left hand on the patient's head, both hands holding, both hands working. Behind her, she heard boots on the road surface, the response team coming forward, organized and purposeful. She held her position until the incoming medics reached her and took over the shoulder. Then she stood and ran the count. 3 wounded, all survivable with what had been done. The convoy's corpsman was en route. The positions at 1,100 meters and ground level were neutralized and confirmed. The perimeter road was quiet. Briggs was standing 20 feet away. He had come out without asking permission, and he was still here, and his face had the look of a man who has watched something he is going to spend a long time thinking about. He was looking at her left arm, the dressing blood worked through its outer layer from 40 minutes of sustained pressure work. He was looking at the fact that she was standing with her hands at her sides in the same expression she brought to everything. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I've been calling you the wrong thing," he said, "since your first day, looking at you the wrong way." She looked at him. "I know. I'm sorry." No performance in it, no positioning, just the plain words. She stood with this for a moment. "Buy me coffee when we get back," she said. "We're square." He nodded. All the performance was gone from it, and what was left was simply a man acknowledging a true thing. She walked back to the response vehicle. He followed. The debrief happened in stages. Bridger ran the medical side. Installation security ran the tactical side, and in that briefing, Tessa learned what the overnight sweep had confirmed: the IED on the perimeter road had been placed by a contracted maintenance worker whose access credentials had been compromised in a broader security incident that base intelligence had been tracking for 6 weeks. The worker was in custody. The vulnerability had been closed. The installation was secure. She filed this information the way she filed all information, completely without surplus reaction. In the trauma bay afterward, Bridger cleaned and sutured the left forearm himself. 7 stitches. He worked in silence, and the silence had a different quality than it had carried 3 weeks ago. Not the silence of a man who hadn't yet decided what to think, but the silence of one who had decided and was comfortable with it. When he finished, he looked at the closed wound at her hand resting open on the table with the same steadiness it always carried. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded as though this was the most honest and satisfactory answer she could have given him. The commanding officer came to the medical facility at 17:30 hours. A colonel with 2 years left before retirement and a face that had logged more of these kinds of afternoons than most careers could hold. He found Tessa on a bench in the hallway outside the trauma bay, left arm in a clean dressing, right hand holding a cup of water she hadn't been drinking. He sat down next to her, not across from her, not standing over her. Next to her, the way certain people with a long history of leading others into difficult places chose to sit when they wanted the conversation to be honest rather than official. He said, "How are you doing?" She looked at the water cup. "I'll be all right, sir." He accepted this without pushing on it. He was quiet for a moment, a comfortable quiet, the silence of a man who had learned long ago that filling space with noise was not the same as using it. "You should know," he said eventually, "that what happened today and yesterday and the 3 weeks before both of those things will be in a detailed report. That report will go to people who will make decisions about your designation, your posting, and what the appropriate institutional response is to what your service record that actually contains, as opposed to what its cover page says it contains." He looked at the middle distance. "I'm not in a position to tell you what those decisions will be, but I'm writing the relevant section myself personally, and it will contain my assessment of what I witnessed." He looked at her directly. "Which is that this installation and the people on it are alive today in numbers that would not be possible without you." She held his gaze. "Thank you, sir." He stood, straightened his jacket, looked down at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has had a very full day and is carrying it with appropriate weight. Get some rest, Commander. He walked down the hallway. She sat with the word for a moment. Not Corman, not Harlow. The word Drummond had used when he came through the doors, bleeding the word that had stopped the room. Commander. She had not confirmed it and had not denied it because it did not require either. It simply was. From down the hall, she heard movement. Drummond was in the hallway, standing 28 hours post-surgery on a shoulder wound, which was not medically advisable, and which she had known he would do at some point because she knew how he operated. He had an IV pole for balance and the look of a man doing something inadvisable with complete awareness of the inadvisability and complete conviction that it was necessary regardless. Bridger appeared at the trauma bay door, registered this with a controlled expression, and did not stop him. Carver was at the charge desk. He turned on his stool, saw Drummond coming down the hallway, and folded his hands in front of him and waited. Briggs was at the far end of the hall, leaning against the wall, watching everything with the expression of a man who had been rebuilding his understanding of a situation across the past 48 hours and was somewhere in the later stages of that project. Drummond stopped in front of Tessa. She looked up at him. He looked at her left arm, at the dressing, at the way she was sitting, not slumped, not loose, just resting in the way that was its own form of readiness. He straightened his spine in the way it had been trained to straighten, regardless of IV lines, regardless of the pull of the surgical repair on his left shoulder, regardless of the 48 hours of blood loss and anesthesia behind him. He came to attention. On behalf of 3rd Special Forces Group, he said, and every man in that convoy today, thank you, Commander Harlow. The hallway was very quiet. She stood up from the bench. She looked at him for a moment. Then she put her right hand on his arm gently in the way you put your hand on someone doing something unnecessarily painful for the right reasons. You need to go back to bed, Cole, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. He didn't move for another second. Then the corner of his mouth moved. She walked him back to room 214 and stood outside the door while he settled. When she came back down the hallway, Briggs was there with a cup of coffee fresh from the break room, which meant he had walked there specifically to get it. She looked at the cup. She took it. He sat down on the other end of the bench at a distance that was respectful without being formal, and they sat in the hallway of the Naval Medical Center Portsmouth Emergency Wing in the late afternoon light without speaking for almost a full minute. It was not uncomfortable. You ever going to tell me what's actually in that file? He said finally. No, she said. He nodded. Fair enough. They drank their coffee. Carver walked past at the end of his shift. He looked at the two of them on the bench for a moment. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply gave a small nod, the nod of a man whose patience had been vindicated so completely that commentary would have been redundant, and walked out the door. It was exactly the right exit. 6 months later, the circles under her eyes had faded sometime in the 3rd month. She hadn't noticed exactly when, only that one morning she looked in the mirror before shift and they were gone. She had put back 8 of the 11 pounds she had lost across the 18 months before Portsmouth, which her doctor had noted at her last physical with the quiet professional satisfaction of someone whose numbers had moved in the correct direction. She slept without waking most nights. Not all of them, but most. The nights she didn't, she used the time to work on the curriculum, and by the time the building came alive around her, she had usually resolved whatever had woken her. The room held 18 people, which was more than any previous iteration of the course had attempted in a single cohort. The original curriculum design had specified 12. Tessa had restructured it 3 weeks before the start date because the waitlist was long and the need did not observe administrative schedules. They were seated in the loose semicircle that forms when people are genuinely paying attention to a single point without being directed to, which meant the first hour had done its job. They ranged from 22 to 31. Most were corpsmen. Several had field rotations behind them. 2 had not yet deployed and were here because someone who had deployed had recommended them specifically. Tessa stood at the front of the room beside a whiteboard with 3 things written on it. The first was a medical protocol, diagram, tourniquet, application, decision tree, updated with field variables that the standard training framework had never incorporated because the people who designed the standard framework had not encountered the gaps from inside them. The second was a ballistics notation elevation, wind correction distance, with the calculations laid out in the sequential logic of a problem that had a correct answer if you respected the arithmetic and a wrong one if you decided that confidence was a substitute for it. The third was a phrase written larger than the other 2 in the plain block letters of someone who was not performing anything. Drag them out alive. She had not told them where the phrase came from. She hadn't needed to, By the third day of the first cohort, it had moved beyond the room on its own momentum, the way true things move without announcement through the people willing to carry them. She was in the middle of explaining the relationship between the two technical elements on the board, not as sequential competencies to be applied one after the other, but as simultaneous demands on the same person in the same moment, requiring specific cognitive and physical disciplines that most training programs treated as belonging to separate professional categories. When her phone on the table lit up, Virginia area code, her mother. "Take 5 minutes," she told the room. She stepped into the hallway. Her mother's voice was warm in the way of someone who has carried significant loss for a long time and has chosen deliberately and continuously not to let it make her smaller. "I saw the article," she said, "the base communications piece. They didn't use your name, but I know your work." Tessa stood with her back to the wall. "It's just medicine, Mom. It's never just anything with you." A brief pause. He would have been proud. Tessa looked through the narrow window in the classroom door. 18 people inside, some reviewing notes, one at the whiteboard, tracing the diagram she had drawn, two in quiet conversation that had the focused quality of people working through a technical problem. "I know," she said. "He is proud, baby." Her mother's voice had the certainty of someone who had spent a long time arriving at a belief and had arrived at it fully. "Somewhere he is." Tessa was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said again. She went back into the room. That evening, after the cohort had left and the room had been cleared and the whiteboard erased and reset, Tessa sat at the table with a cup of cold coffee and her left arm resting on the surface, healed now, the scar matte and pale in the way of scar tissue that has had 6 months to become simply part of the landscape. Her laptop was open to the curriculum notes for the following week's field triage module, the section she had spent the most time developing, because it was the section where the standard framework had the most significant gaps and where the cost of those gaps was paid most immediately and most irreversibly. Her email was open in the background. 4 messages, 2 administrative. One from Carver. He had transferred to a training post at Little Creek 6 weeks ago and still sent a weekly note that was always short and always contained exactly as much as it needed to contain. The 4th message had no sender name and no subject line. She looked at it. She set down the coffee. She opened it. No text in the body. A single image attachment, low resolution. The quality of a photograph taken on a device not optimized for photography. Grainy motion blurred at the edges, taken from a distance. A street somewhere. The architecture was not American. Could have been Eastern Europe. Could have been somewhere else. In the middle ground of the frame, a man was walking away from the camera along the near side of the street, far enough away that identification was arguable. But she had worked alongside this person for 2 years in conditions that forged the kind of recognition that didn't require resolution to operate. She knew the width of those shoulders. She knew the way those feet met the ground, the slightly outward-turned right foot, a habit from an old ankle fracture that had healed imperfectly and that he had refused to have corrected because he didn't want the recovery time. She knew the way he held his hands at rest, loose fingers, slightly spread, the natural position of someone whose hands had been trained to remain continuously available. She had last seen those hands in Afghanistan in the fall of 2021, and the 3 years since had not changed the way they looked from a distance, even at this resolution, even in this light. She stared at the image for a long time. The room was completely quiet. Outside, the installation ran its evening vehicles and voices and the low ambient sound of a bass at dusk, ordinary and continuous and indifferent to the content of her screen. She thought about the kitchen table in Virginia, her mother's hands flat on the wood, the cost of what she had said. She thought about 12 years of keeping a promise and 1 week of understanding why some promises were worth less than the lives of the people you could save if you broke them. She thought about 18 people in the room today, learning to carry 2 things at once without dropping either. About a phrase on a whiteboard that had started here and was moving through 4 more states. About a doctor who had told her welcome aboard and meant it. She looked at the image. Something shifted in her chest, not dramatically, not the way things shift in stories. More the way a long-held structural tension releases when the load is redistributed. Slow, quiet. A configuration that had been maintained for 3 years, beginning to move into something else. The corner of her mouth moved, just once, just barely, but it moved. She closed the laptop. She stacked her notes in the orderly way she stacked everything, efficiently without surplus motion, ready for morning. She capped her pen. She turned off the lamp. She stood. Her phone showed 2,112 hours. Tomorrow's first session was at 800. 18 people who needed to learn how to keep other people alive in the conditions that most reliably threatened it. A curriculum that would be running in 4 more states before the year was finished. A phrase on a whiteboard that was moving through the service, the way true things move without announcement through the people willing to carry them forward. She picked up her jacket. She walked to the door of the empty classroom and put her hand on the light switch. She looked back one last time at the whiteboard, blank clean, ready for whatever the first sentence of tomorrow would be. She turned off the light. Outside Portsmouth ran its evening. The perimeter lights came on in sequence as the sky went dark, steady, and reliable, marking the edges of things the way they mark them every night. The air was coastal Virginia autumn salt and cold pine, and the faint sound of water somewhere in the dark beyond the fence line. Tessa Harlow walked across the parking lot with her jacket over one arm and her bag over the other. She walked without hurry, without excess motion, with the quiet gravity of someone who had spent a long time learning to occupy exactly the right amount of space, no more, no less, and had stopped thinking about it because it had become simply who she was. Somewhere on a street that might have been Eastern Europe, a man walked away from a camera with a slightly outward-turned right foot and his hands loose at his sides, and somewhere in a file that required level 4 clearance to access a name was waiting to be revised. And somewhere in the Virginia hills, the grass was going brown in October, the way it always did. The way it had when a father stood behind his daughter on a cold morning and handed her something that would cost her and save her and define her in measures she wouldn't understand until she was old enough to have needed it. Tomorrow at 800, there would be 18 people in that room. Tomorrow at 800, she would stand at the front of it. She was ready. She had always been ready. That was the part it had taken everyone else a while to see. But they saw it now, and they would not forget it.